When it comes to the majority of platforming icons, everyone has that one game where the series died for them. As soon as the 6th generation of consoles started, one by one platformers started to decline in quality, meaning people started to abandon each series. The most famous example of this would be Sonic the Hedgehog. For some people the series lost it with Sonic 06, for some it was Sonic Heroes, and some people gave up on Sonic as early as Sonic Adventure. So what about Crash Bandicoot? Naughty Dog moved on to Jak and Daxter once the PS2 was released, but Crash games were still produced. Some people gave up with Crash Bandicoot The Wrath of Cortex, which tried to replicate the PS1 titles. For some, Crash Team Insanity was the final nail in the coffin as it tried to mix things up and arguably lost too much of the Crash charm. For others though, the series died once it was rebooted with the game Crash of the Titans. This was the game where I gave up on the series, not because I thought the game looked terrible, but I had no interest in a Crash reboot, especially because I liked Crash Twinsanity. I never actually played the game though, so I recently decided to finally check it out for myself. So, does Crash of the Titans work as a reboot for the Crash series, or was I right to avoid it? Let's have a look. There's a cutscene before the title screen that uses shadows to retell the origins of Crash Bandicoot. Cortex invents a ray that turns creatures into mutants. As he is testing it out, he shoots a creature that turns into Crash. Nina, Cortex's niece from Crash Insanity, then tries the ray for herself and manages to turn a creature into a large evil mutant. The actual story of the game is that Cortex is trying to create an army of these mutants by stealing the energy of the world called Mojo. After Crash stops Cortex from stealing the Mojo, Uka Uka decides to replace Cortex with Nina, who brainwashes Crash's sister Coco to create a device called the Doominator. The rest of the game is Crash fighting each of the main villains from the series while trying to save his sister. Each of the characters have been redesigned as Crash of the Titans is a reboot, but I can't say I like the new designs. I don't mind how Crash looks, but Uka Uka and Aku Aku look nothing like they used to, and Cortex looks a bit too much like a Smurf for my liking. You're never going to make fans of a series happy when you redesign all the characters, but this one does feel like an unnecessary change. The plot is pretty basic, as it's just Crash rescuing Coco and stopping the bad guys, and there are no new characters. Everyone in this game is from a previous title. These two choices to me indicate that they wanted older fans of this series to be able to enjoy this game by keeping it simple and familiar. They didn't pull this off though, because some of the redesigns are so drastic. They either needed to introduce a new villain or any new characters to really reinvent the Crash universe, or stick to the older designs, but they didn't do either of this, making me a bit confused about who exactly this game is meant to be for. Crash of the Titans is a 3D platformer. You run through levels jumping across platforms, fighting different enemies, and jacking mutants, which is the game's main feature. Before I talk about the mutants, let's start by looking at the levels themselves. The levels are mostly linear. There are secrets to be found, but there's normally always one strict path that you have to take to progress. You also have extremely limited camera control. The camera is always locked facing forwards, and moving the right analog stick only wiggles the camera a little bit. It feels quite restrictive for a 3D platformer to be designed this way, and unlike Super Mario 3D World, the level design isn't strong enough to make the forced perspective work. It seems like the camera and levels are like this to try and match the original Crash Bandicoot games, which was a bad idea. It makes the whole game feel simple and dated, purely because this was a reboot released in 2007, but the original Crash Bandicoot was one of the first 3D platformers ever made and came out in the 90s. It doesn't negatively impact core gameplay, but seeing how Crash Twinsanity had open worlds, this feels like a step backwards. Throughout levels, Crash will run into small enemies and large mutants. By attacking the mutants enough, they will become dazed and Crash can jack them. After jacking them, you take full control of them directly. You spend about a third of the game controlling Crash normally, and the other 2/3 controlling mutants. There are 15 mutants in total, and they are split into 3 different types of mutant. There are standard mutants, mutants that fire projectiles, and heavy mutants that are slow but have strong attacks. Despite this being a platformer, sadly the mutants essentially are only there for the game's combat. Sometimes you'll have to smash something using a mutant as Crash won't be strong enough, but there are no real puzzles involving the mutants' different abilities. The mutants do have different attacks that are used in combat, but none of them really have their own unique fighting style. Each mutant does have a special attack you can perform by holding A, but none of them are that useful. I found that I could just tap X no matter what mutant I was using and be just fine, as even when your mutant's health is low, you can just daze another mutant and jack it. The mutants are only used to add to the combat, and they don't even do this well, as they control very similar to Crash, they're just bigger. Really, the mutants as a gameplay feature is fine, but there's definitely a lot of wasted potential here to really add variety and keep things fresh, as jacking mutants does get old quite quickly. Let's take a look at the combat. A new combat system has been added, which means Crash now has a health bar. The controls are X for a light attack, Y for a heavy attack, and RT blocks. You can also perform Crash's signature spin attack by spinning the control stick and pressing X, although Crash gets dizzy if you use it too much. You unlock new moves and combos as you collect mojo orbs that are found scattered in levels and are dropped by defeating enemies. I did not enjoy myself when fighting enemies in this game. It's first of all weird having this sort of combat in a Crash Bandicoot game. You have to unlock the spin attack before you can use it, so when I first booted up this game, I had to punch enemies as Crash to kill them, and it felt weird. Crash is not a natural fit for this sort of combat, and as Batman Arkham Asylum hadn't been released yet so the developers couldn't rip it off, you'll mostly just be mindlessly button mashing. In the original Crash games, enemies were just an obstacle to get past, but now fighting enemies is what you spend most of your time doing. Even if you remove the fact that this is a Crash game and try to praise the combat on its own merits, it still isn't good. Your light attack, which is your quickest attack, actually cannot be done quickly. If you press X in a certain direction but an enemy approaches you from a different direction, you have to wait for a little bit for Crash to finish his attack before you can attack the other enemy. It makes the player feel like they're locked into every attack they do, which makes everything feel clunky rather than fluid. This isn't helped by the fact that you're always fighting multiple enemies at once. It's so easy to get hit multiple times when fighting a group, as once one of them hits you, it will stun them, giving the others a chance to hit you as well. The only attack you get to deal with large crouch is the spin attack, which doesn't do that much damage and, as I already mentioned, can only be used for a small amount of time before Crash gets dizzy. At the start of the game the combat isn't too bad, but later on, once the levels start to become more difficult, I found myself getting annoyed with how cheaply you can get hit because of how stiff the combat feels. The combat takes up most of the game, but there is also a lot of platforming here. I found the actual platforming sections to be uninspired though. You jump between platforms, sometimes you swing on ropes, sometimes you have to wall jump, but there's nothing that stands out. The worst case of uninspired level design is that sometimes you have to jump across moving L shapes, and it just feels like the developer didn't have any ideas for the platforming of this game. The mutants don't add anything to the platforming either because they can't actually jump. On top of this, the level themes aren't even interesting. Despite being limited by the PS1, Naughty Dog managed to make the world of Crash Bandicoot feel unique and have its own charm to it. With Crash of the Titans being a reboot, they took out some of the original charm as expected, but they didn't replace it with anything. Levels are bare and use the same themes that you would expect in any other platformer. With the mutants being the new additions to the series, you would think that they would work towards making an interesting world where all these mutants exist. They didn't do this though, making this game feel quite soulless. My save file says it took me around 5 hours or so to beat the game, but it was closer to 6. Reviews at the time complained about the game's length, but I honestly didn't have a problem with it as the game doesn't feel short. Crash of the Titans is a game with one good idea with poor execution and nothing else. It removes everything that made Crash Bandicoot stand out and replaced it with the mutants. This could have worked if they spent more time using the mutants to make a game that was interesting, but instead they add very little. This makes the game feel quite generic. It's not a bad game to play, it's just too forgettable, which is probably why most people don't talk about this game that much. My score is 5.5 out of 10. An okay platformer that fails to reinvent Crash, but also fails to recapture the magic of the older titles.